This isn't a story about politics, rather it's about character. Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, two one-time rivals who would go on to become dear friends. Now, let me take you back to the presidential election of 1976. All campaigns have their share of sharp rhetoric, and that certainly was true nearly 50 years ago when Republican Jerry Ford battled Democrat Jimmy Carter for the White House. For months, they crisscrossed the country telling people why they shouldn't vote for the other.
Mr. Ford, so far as I know, except for avoiding another Watergate, has not accomplished one single major program for this country.
Governor Carter apparently doesn't know the facts.
While both Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter were unlikely friends, they both started out as unlikely candidates. In 1976, Jimmy Carter was the Georgia governor. He was little known outside of the state. He was born and raised in the town of Plains, Georgia, population 683. He was actually the first president to be born in a hospital. Carter managed his family's peanut farm down there, and no one thought he could run for president because few people thought a Southerner could win at the national level. In fact, in an early poll, Jimmy Carter ranked 12th among Democrats seeking to get the nomination. Gerald Ford grew up in Michigan. He played college football at the University of Michigan. He was a national all-star. His team won back-to-back national titles. In fact, the Green Bay Packers offered him a pro contract, but he turned down the offer. Instead, Gerald Ford went to Yale. He was a model for Cosmopolitan magazine. In fact, graced the cover of the magazine. Back in Michigan, he got involved in politics and eventually was elected to the House of Representatives. Fast forward to 1973. Nixon was president, and his vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign in the midst of a corruption scandal. The 25th Amendment allowed Nixon to choose his new VP with the approval of Congress, and he chose Gerald Ford. 9 months later, in the midst of the Watergate scandal, Richard Nixon resigned from office, and Gerald Ford therefore succeeded to the presidency. He is the first president never to win a national election. But within 9 months, he became the most powerful man in the free world. Now, Nixon's fall from grace was unprecedented. People may not know that he had been a very popular president for a while. In the 1972 presidential election against George McGovern, Nixon won 49 of the 50 states. He won the election by 18 million votes. That's the largest margin of victory in history. In other words, when Nixon resigned in disgrace, Ford inherited a mess, and it really proved too much to overcome. And that set the stage for the 1976 election when Jimmy Carter battled Ford. It was close. Ford actually won more states than Carter, but Carter won the election by just over 1.5 million votes. At his inauguration, as Jimmy Carter was sworn in as president, the very first thing he said brought about a standing ovation. But not for himself.
For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he has done to heal our land.
The friendship between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter really started in 1981. When Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated, President Ronald Reagan sent 3 former presidents to represent the U.S. at the funeral: Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter. On the long flight over to Egypt, Ford and Carter didn't even speak to each other. But on the flight home, they did start to engage in some small talk, and that eventually led to some deeper dialogue. They talked about everything from their children to nuclear power. They realized that they actually had a lot in common. Both served proudly in the Navy. Both men had been married only once and had stayed married for decades. Both men had 3 sons before a daughter finally came along. Both wives had been popular and beloved first ladies. And both were men of incredibly deep Christian faith. Carter was a Baptist and Ford an Episcopalian. That flight home from Egypt led to a deep friendship. They started teaming up with each other on worldwide humanitarian causes. In all, they took more than 30 trips together around the world for charitable causes. Ford became actively involved in the Carter Center, and the two became best of friends.
And he and I commented often that when we were traveling somewhere in an automobile or airplane, we hated to reach our destination. because we enjoyed the private times that we had together.
The two men talked all the time. Their families even grew close and traveled together. It was Gerald Ford who made the unusual request to Jimmy Carter that whoever lived the longest would give the eulogy at the other's funeral. As it turned out, Gerald Ford was the first of the two to pass away. It was 2007, and Jimmy Carter gave the eulogy, talking about the most important thing that those two men had in common.
That we are saved by the grace of God through our faith in Jesus Christ.
Their wives had also forged a special friendship. When Betty Ford died in 2011, Rosalind Carter gave the eulogy. And when Jimmy Carter passed away on December 29th, he was 100 years old, the oldest in American history. And even though Gerald Ford had died 17 years earlier, before his death, he actually wrote the words for Jimmy Carter's eulogy. And at the Carter funeral just 3 weeks ago, Gerald Ford's oldest son, Michael, read the eulogy that his father had written 2 decades ago for Jimmy Carter.
I'm looking forward to our reunion. We have much to catch up on.
Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, two political rivals who became the best of friends. As Gerald Ford's biographer wrote, there was more that united them than that divided them. Politics may describe them, but their faith defined them. And in our scripture this morning, we read about 2 of Jesus' 12 disciples. They were polar opposites, but their love for Christ was bigger than their disagreements.